Deep in the rural area on the east side of Glastonbury Mountain in the American state of Vermont lies a place called West Townshend. This location is incredibly significant because it places West Townshend right in the middle of the so-called Bennington Triangle, which has earned a reputation over the decades as being one of the most haunted and mysterious places in all of America. The triangle itself is a loosely defined area that encompasses a ghost town called Glastonbury, which used to be a small logging community centered around the mountain. The town was completely abandoned at the end of the 19th century after the logging boom died down and the mills closed up. As a result of this, the greater Glastonbury area, which West Townshend is definitely a part of, has reverted back into untouched, pristine wilderness. Even by Vermont standards, this area is incredibly rugged, remote, and difficult to navigate. The triangle has earned its spooky reputation due in large part to the alarming number of unexplained disappearances that have occurred there over the last 100 years. People go in, and they simply never come out. Furthermore, over those same 100 years, there have been dozens of sightings of what locals call the Bennington Monster. This is apparently an 8-foot-tall, hair-covered creature that roams the deep forests and mountains of Glastonbury. And some people honestly believe that this creature is behind many, if not all, of these incredibly strange disappearances. On November 23, 1943, a 37-year-old man named Carl Herrick and his cousin Henry decided to make the trip to West Townshend to do some deer hunting. They were both experienced woodsmen who knew how to handle themselves in the forest, so they were not particularly worried about the rumors of the area. They packed up their gear, grabbed their rifles, and set off into the dense trees. But at some point during their hunt, the pair got separated. This is a common occurrence when hunting in thick woods, so initially Henry did not panic. He spent some time walking around the general area, yelling out for Carl and looking around the dense brush, but he could not find him. After about an hour of this, Henry assumed that Carl must have gotten tired or cold and simply walked back to their base camp. So Henry turned around and made his way back to the camp. But when Henry arrived, the camp was completely empty. Carl was not there. Henry sat down and waited around for a little while, hoping to hear his cousin walking through the brush, but as the minutes ticked by, he got this terrible sinking feeling in his chest that something was terribly wrong. And so, relatively quickly, he made the decision to leave the camp and go find the police. When the police showed up, they recognized the danger of being lost in the Bennington Triangle, and they immediately launched a massive search effort. For 3 straight days, search parties and local volunteers combed the entire rugged area, putting themselves through physical exhaustion, but there was just not a single sign of Carl anywhere. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. But then, on the 3rd day of the search, Henry was walking through a remote clearing in the woods when he spotted something on the ground. He walked closer and discovered Carl's body. Carl was lying completely motionless, face down in the dirt right in the middle of this clearing. Initially, Henry thought that maybe Carl had just collapsed from exhaustion and was still alive, so he ran over to him, knelt down, and rolled him over. But very quickly, Henry realized that it was too late. Carl was deceased. However, when Henry looked at Carl, he did not see any obvious signs of a struggle. There were no bullet wounds, no deep cuts, and no major trauma. He had some minor scratching on his arms and on his hands, but that was about it. Henry stood up and began looking around the immediate area for clues, and what he found only made the situation more confusing. About 70 feet away from where Carl was lying, Henry spotted Carl's rifle. It was loaded and leaning up against a tree, and right next to the rifle, lying on the ground, was a single expended shell casing. To make things even more bizarre, when Henry looked closer at the ground around Carl's body, he noticed several massive tracks that looked exactly like bear tracks. The police arrived at the scene, documented the evidence, and took Carl's body to the medical examiner to determine how he had died. When the official cause of death came back, it was absolutely baffling. The medical examiner concluded that Carl had been squeezed to death. The pressure on his chest had been so immense that his ribs actually broke and punctured his lungs, causing him to suffocate. So, based on the bear tracks and the broken ribs, the authorities put forward a theory of what happened. They suggested that Carl must have been out in the woods by himself when he suddenly encountered a large black bear. He fired one shot at the bear, which accounted for the spent shell casing on the ground. Thinking that the bear was dead or incapacitated, Carl walked over to check on it, and the bear suddenly attacked him, wrapping its arms around him and squeezing him to death before wandering off. And that was the official conclusion. But when you actually stop and think about this theory, it completely falls apart. First of all, if Carl encountered a black bear and fired a single shot, he would know as an experienced hunter that one shot from his rifle is rarely going to be enough to instantly drop a large bear. He would want to keep his distance, keep his weapon loaded, and keep it aimed at the animal in case he needed to fire a second or third time. But even if Carl was somehow absolutely confident that his single shot had killed the bear, why would he risk his life by walking 70 feet over to check on it without his gun? Why would he take his rifle, lean it up against a tree 70 feet away, and then walk completely unarmed toward a massive, potentially dangerous predator? No hunter in their right mind would ever do that. You would carry your gun with you every single step of the way. But even if we assume that Carl did make that incredibly foolish mistake, and he walked over to the bear unarmed, and the bear was actually still alive and leaped up to attack him, there is another massive problem. Black bears do not squeeze people to death. When a bear attacks a human, it bites, it scratches, and it tears its victim apart. It does not put them in a bear hug and squeeze them until their ribs break. And remember, Carl only had very light scratches on his wrists and hands. He had no bite marks and no signs of a traditional bear attack. So either this was the very first time in the history of the world that a black bear decided to squeeze a man to death without scratching him, or something else entirely squeezed Carl. But what kind of creature is strong enough to crush a grown man's chest to the point of breaking his ribs, and just happens to be roaming around the Bennington Triangle? It really makes you wonder. Fast forward to September 6, 2006, in Portland, Oregon. A 51-year-old woman named Susan Kuhnsen was returning home from a long, exhausting shift at her job as an emergency room nurse. Susan was a dedicated professional who had spent 30 years working in the high-stress environment of the ER, which meant she was used to dealing with sudden chaos, blood, and physical violence. On her way home that evening, she decided to stop at a local hair salon to get her hair dyed a slightly different shade of brown. While she was waiting for her appointment, she picked up a magazine and began flipping through the pages. As she did, a particular quote caught her eye and stood out to her. The quote said, "I will not live an unlived life. I will not live in fear." At the time, Susan was going through an incredibly difficult period in her personal life. She was constantly fighting with her husband, Mike. They had been married for nearly 18 years, but their marriage had become completely toxic, filled with bitter, awful arguments. Susan had finally gathered up the courage to tell Mike that she wanted a divorce, but Mike was absolutely furious and refused to accept it. Susan was feeling overwhelmed and was looking for anything to latch onto to keep her strong, and this quote gave her the motivation she needed to follow through with this incredibly difficult decision. About an hour later, with her hair freshly dyed, Susan hopped back into her car and drove the last couple of miles to her quiet, peaceful neighborhood. She pulled into the driveway of her one-story Cape Cod home, which was surrounded by a nice gray picket fence. She walked up to the back door, unlocked it, and stepped into their mudroom. Right away, she noticed a handwritten note lying on the counter next to the microwave. Since she and Mike were still living in the same house while they sorted through their issues, she figured it was from him. She picked it up and read it. The note said, "Sue, I have had trouble sleeping. I have gone to the beach. I will see you in a couple of days." Susan put the note back down, feeling a sense of relief that she would have the house to herself for a few days. She unlocked the door that led from the mudroom into the kitchen, and as soon as she opened it, she heard the loud, rhythmic beeping of their home security alarm. This was strange because the alarm was supposed to be off, but she figured maybe Mike had set it by mistake before he left. She walked all the way through the house to the front door, unlocked it, stepped outside to check the mail, and then went back inside. After she got back inside, she shut and locked the front door behind her, kicked off her shoes, and began walking across the living room toward the kitchen to make some dinner. She got about halfway there when she happened to look over to her left, and she noticed that the guest bedroom on the first floor was completely dark. This struck her as very unusual because every single morning before she left for work, Susan would walk around the house and open every single curtain so that when she came home in the evening, the house would be bright and filled with natural sunlight. She stood there staring at the dark doorway of the guest room, wondering if she had somehow forgotten to open the curtains in that specific room. But as she was staring, the door slowly creaked open further, and a man she had never seen before stepped out from behind the door and began walking directly toward her. The man was of medium height and medium build. He had a hat pulled down low over his eyes to obscure his face. He was wearing bright yellow rubber gloves, and in his right hand, he was holding a heavy framing hammer. For the vast majority of people, encountering a completely unknown intruder inside their home carrying a deadly weapon would prompt them to scream, turn around, and run out the door as fast as possible. But not Susan. She had spent 30 years as an ER nurse. She had cracked open people's ribs to massage their hearts, she had administered IVs to thrashing patients suffering from violent withdrawals, and she and her fellow nurses regularly trained in physical self-defense because the ER could be an incredibly unpredictable and dangerous place. She knew how to slip chokeholds, how to leverage her body weight, and how to defend herself. So, instead of running away, Susan did the absolute last thing the intruder expected. She ran directly at him, moving faster than he was coming at her. She knew that if she could get inside his reach, the swing of the hammer would lose its power. She rammed her body straight into him. Even though Susan was only about 5 feet 5 inches tall and significantly outweighed by this man, who was about 5 feet 9 inches and weighed around 200 pounds, her sudden momentum slammed him hard against the living room wall. The man reacted by bringing the hammer down on her head, striking her once. But because she was so close to him, the blow did not have enough force to knock her down or subdue her. In fact, due to the massive rush of adrenaline, she barely even felt it. She grabbed hold of him, pinning him against the wall, and began screaming, "Who are you? What do you want?" Part of her still thought this was just a burglary, and she was willing to give him whatever he wanted if he would just leave. But the man did not say a single word. He just stared at her and tried to raise the hammer again. Susan realized in that instant that this was not a robbery. This man was there for one reason only, to take her life. She pushed even harder against him, using all of her strength to pin his arms. Finally, the man spoke. He uttered the only two words he would say the entire time. He looked at her and said, "You are strong." Hearing those words sent a second wave of adrenaline through Susan's body. She thought to herself, "No, I am going to live." She managed to wrestle the heavy hammer completely out of his grip, and while still pinning him against the wall, she swung the hammer and struck him in the head 3 times. But the man was desperate and managed to reach out and grab the hammer back. As he did, Susan released her grip on the weapon, reached up with both hands, grabbed him by the throat, and began choking him. The man immediately stopped trying to swing the hammer and brought both of his hands up to his neck, trying to pry her fingers off. Susan realized that she had successfully put him on the defensive. She squeezed tighter and tighter, crushing his windpipe with all her might. She screamed at him, "I will call an ambulance if you tell me who sent you." The man could not speak. He just let out a low grunt. Susan continued to squeeze until the man's face turned a deep shade of purple and his eyes began to roll back into his head. As an ER nurse, Susan knew exactly how close he was to dying, and she realized she was not prepared to take a life if she did not have to. So, she let go of his throat and threw him to the ground, turning to run toward the front door to escape, but the man was not finished. He jumped up, lunged after her, and grabbed her by the ankle, tripping her hard onto the floor. Susan rolled over onto her back, and suddenly the man was right on top of her, raising the hammer to bring it down on her skull. Instinctively, Susan sat up as fast as she could and bit down with all her strength on the inner part of his upper leg. She bit so hard that her teeth tore right through his pants and deep into his flesh. The man let out a horrific scream of pain, completely losing his balance and unable to strike her. As he staggered back, Susan released her bite, got up onto one knee, and lunged forward again, biting him as hard as she could on the side of his ribcage, once again tearing through his shirt. The man was now howling at the top of his lungs in absolute agony. Susan grabbed him, using his momentum to throw him to the ground, but she fell with him, landing directly behind his back. The man was still fighting, trying to swing the hammer blindly behind him to hit her. At this point, Susan realized that this man was never going to stop. He was not going to talk, and if she let him up, he would eventually kill her. She decided right then and there, "I am going to kill him first." She wrapped her arm tightly around his throat, putting him into a highly effective, professional chokehold. The man thrashed and struggled, trying to slip her grip, but Susan held on with everything she had, squeezing tighter and tighter. After a few minutes of intense struggling, the man finally stopped moving. He went completely limp. Susan calmly stood up, looked down at his body, and confirmed that he was dead. She picked up his hammer, walked calmly out of her front door, and walked next door to her neighbor's house. She knocked on the door, and when her neighbor opened it, she was shocked to see Susan standing there. Her clothes were tattered, she was covered in bruises and blood, but she appeared completely calm and collected. The neighbor asked, "Susan, what is going on? Why do you have a hammer?" Susan looked at her and calmly said, "I had an intruder in my house who tried to kill me, so I killed him. I need to use your phone to call the police." The stunned neighbor led her inside, and Susan calmly dialed 911 and explained exactly what had happened. When the police and paramedics arrived, they entered Susan's home and confirmed that the attacker was indeed deceased. They identified him as 59-year-old Ed Haffey, a Vietnam veteran with a long criminal record. When they searched the house, they found Ed's backpack in the guest bedroom. Inside the backpack was a notebook containing detailed instructions on what Ed was supposed to do after he successfully killed Susan. One of the instructions was to immediately place a call to a man named Mike. It turned out that Mike, Susan's husband, had hired Ed Haffey and paid him $50,000 to murder his wife. Earlier that day, Mike had personally let Ed into the house, showed him where to hide in the guest room, and then wrote the note about going to the beach to establish his alibi. Mike was arrested and initially denied having anything to do with the plot, but eventually, the evidence against him was so overwhelming that he confessed. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison for soliciting the murder of his wife. While Mike never gave a clear explanation for why he did it, it was obvious that a divorce would have ruined him financially, whereas if Susan died, he would inherit their beautiful Cape Cod home. Immediately after the sentencing, Susan filed a civil lawsuit against Mike for $1 million, stating that she wanted to make sure he had absolutely no money left to hire another hitman to finish the job from behind bars. However, Susan did not have to worry for long because Mike died of natural causes shortly after entering prison. Susan never faced any criminal charges for the death of Ed Haffey and was widely praised as a hero for her incredible bravery and survival instincts. Let us go back in time to August 22, 1922, in the wealthy neighborhood of Beverly Hills, California. On that evening, several loud gunshots rang out from inside a stately, beautiful Victorian home owned by a wealthy couple named Dolly and Fred Ostrich. The neighbors, startled by the sudden violence, immediately called the police. When the first officers arrived and stepped through the front door, they were greeted by a scene of utter chaos. The entire first floor of the mansion had been completely trashed. Furniture was knocked over, drawers were pulled out, and valuables were scattered everywhere. Lying on the living room floor was Fred Ostrich. He had been shot to death, and lying right next to his body were three .25 caliber shell casings. With their weapons drawn, the police began clearing the first floor, but they found no one. Suddenly, they heard faint, panicked screaming coming from the second floor of the house. They ran up the stairs, searching room after room, but the upstairs appeared empty. Then, they heard the screaming again, and they realized it was coming from inside a locked walk-in closet in the master bedroom. The officers approached the door and yelled out, "Who is in there? What are you doing in the closet?" A woman's voice yelled back, "I am Dolly. I am okay, but I am trapped." The officers tried the door handle, but it was locked tight from the outside. They asked Dolly if she knew where the key was, but she said she had no idea. Before trying to kick the heavy wooden door down, the officers decided to search the other bedrooms on the second floor to see if they could find the key. Sure enough, across the hall in a guest bedroom, lying right in the middle of the floor, was a small key. They grabbed it, ran back the closet, unlocked the door, and Dolly stepped out. She was physically uninjured, but she was hysterical, crying and trembling. The detective sat her down and asked her to tell them what had happened. She told them a chaotic and bizarre story. She said she had been inside the walk-in closet, hanging up some clothes with her back to the door, when she suddenly heard a loud, violent physical fight break out on the first floor between her husband and an unknown intruder. Before she could even turn around to go see what was happening, her closet door was slammed shut from the outside, and she heard the lock turn. She never saw who locked her in. This story was a massive head-scratcher for the detectives. They began trying to figure out how this could have physically occurred. If there was only one intruder, how did he manage to fight Fred downstairs, run upstairs, lock Dolly in the closet, run back downstairs, kill Fred, ransack the entire house, and then run back upstairs to toss the closet key into a completely different room before escaping? It made absolutely no sense. Or were there multiple intruders? Dolly noted that despite the house being completely torn apart, the only thing she could tell was missing was a highly valuable diamond-encrusted wristwatch that Fred always wore. The detectives also found it strange that the killer had used a .25 caliber pistol. This is an incredibly small, low-caliber weapon that was much more commonly carried by women in their purses during that era, rather than by professional home invaders. When the police began interviewing the neighbors, they quickly learned that Fred and Dolly had a highly volatile relationship. They fought constantly, and earlier that very night they had gotten into an incredibly loud, screaming argument. Naturally, the police wanted to point the finger at Dolly, but they faced an impossible physical hurdle. How could Dolly have shot her husband downstairs, ran upstairs, locked herself inside a closet from the outside, and then somehow thrown the key across the hallway into another bedroom? It was physically impossible. With no other suspects, the police began digging into Dolly's past to see if they could find a motive or a secret accomplice. Dolly was born in Germany in 1880, and her family had immigrated to Milwaukee, Wisconsin near the turn of the century. There, she met and married Fred, who was 3 years older than her. Fred was a highly driven, successful businessman who built a massive textile empire, opening factories all across the Midwest. But Fred was also a raging alcoholic who was prone to extreme violence and verbal abuse. Their marriage quickly became a nightmare. Fred was cruel, and Dolly was incredibly lonely. When they moved from Milwaukee to Southern California in 1918, their new neighbors immediately noticed how unhappy they were. They bickered constantly in public. The police searched for any evidence that Dolly was having an affair, but they could find no record of her being seen with any other man. It seemed that while they were miserable, they were faithful. With absolutely no physical evidence and no logical way Dolly could have locked herself in that closet, the case eventually went cold. Dolly, now a wealthy widow, inherited Fred's massive $1-million estate. She moved into a brand new, beautiful home in Los Angeles and began dating her estate lawyer, Herman Shapiro. But history seemed to repeat itself. Shapiro was a busy man who worked incredibly long hours, leaving Dolly lonely once again. So Dolly did what she always did. She went out and found a second boyfriend, a man named Roy Klum, and began secretly seeing both men at the exact same time. A year after Fred's murder, Captain Herman Klein of the Beverly Hills Police Department decided to drop by Herman Shapiro's law office to ask some follow-up questions about the estate. While he was sitting at Shapiro's desk, the captain's eyes fell upon a stunning, diamond-encrusted wristwatch lying right next to some paperwork. It looked identical to the watch Dolly had reported stolen on the night of Fred's murder. The captain asked Shapiro where he got the watch. Shapiro, completely relaxed, said that Dolly had given it to him as a gift. He explained that he had also been suspicious when she gave it to him, but when he asked her about it, Dolly claimed that the watch had never actually been stolen. She said she had made a mistake on the night of the murder and had later found the watch tucked deep underneath a sofa cushion in their living room. Captain Klein was not buying this story for a single second. He immediately went to confront Dolly, who gave him the same casual explanation, claiming she just forgot to tell the police that she had found it. The local newspapers caught wind of this development and the story exploded in the press, putting all the suspicion right back on Dolly. Spooked by the intense media coverage, Dolly's second boyfriend, Roy Klum, went to the police and made a shocking confession. He admitted that Dolly had given him a .25 caliber pistol and begged him to get rid of it, so he had driven to the La Brea tar pits and thrown it in. Shortly after, one of Dolly's neighbors also came forward and admitted that Dolly had given her a second .25 caliber pistol and asked her to bury it in her backyard. The police recovered both weapons, but they were so badly rusted and deteriorated that ballistics testing was impossible. Dolly casually dismissed the guns, claiming she had simply felt uncomfortable having weapons in her house after her husband's tragic death. In July of 1923, the police finally arrested Dolly and charged her with Fred's murder. But when the case went to court, the prosecutors faced the exact same physical obstacle. They could not explain how she could have locked herself in that closet from the outside. With no logical explanation, the charges were dropped and Dolly was released. 7 years passed, and the sensational murder of Fred Ostrick was largely forgotten. But in 1930, Dolly and her lawyer boyfriend Herman Shapiro got into a massive fight and broke up. Furious and feeling betrayed, Shapiro walked straight into the police station and told the detectives that he knew exactly what had happened to Fred and that he had the man who did it sitting in his office right now. The police rushed to Shapiro's office, walked inside, and found a small, quiet, unassuming man named Otto Sandhuber. Otto was a sewing machine repairman who also wrote cheap pulp fiction stories. And the story he told the police that day was more bizarre and shocking than any fiction he had ever written. It turned out that almost a decade before the murder, back in 1913, Otto was a 17-year-old working in one of Fred's factories in Milwaukee. One day, Dolly complained to Fred that her sewing machine was broken, and Fred asked his young employee, Otto, to go over to his house to fix it. Dolly knew Otto was coming, and she was highly attracted to him. When Otto arrived, Dolly opened the door wearing nothing but a silk robe, stockings, and heavy perfume. They immediately began a passionate affair. At first, they met in cheap hotels, but that became too expensive and difficult to hide. So Dolly hatched a plan. She convinced Otto to quit his job, leave his life behind, and move secretly into the tiny, uninsulated attic of the Ostrich home. For the next 5 years, Otto lived like a ghost directly above Fred's head. When Fred left for work, Otto would come down, spend the day with Dolly, clean the house, and make bathtub gin. Before Fred returned, Otto would climb back into the attic, where he would read and write stories by candlelight. Fred occasionally complained about hearing footsteps, and he noticed their food and cigars were disappearing incredibly fast, but Dolly always managed to convince him that he was just imagining things. When they moved to Los Angeles in 1918, Dolly specifically chose a house with an attic and sent Otto ahead to hide there before Fred even arrived. On the night of August 22, 1922, Otto was in his attic hideaway when he heard Fred and Dolly get into a violent physical fight. Fearing for Dolly's life, Otto grabbed two .25 caliber pistols, ran downstairs, and confronted Fred. Fred was absolutely stunned to see his wife's former teenage factory worker standing in his living room. Fred lunged at Otto, and Otto panicked and shot him 3 times. Dolly quickly took control of the situation. She staged the house to look like a robbery, told Otto to lock her inside the closet, throw the key across the hall, and run back up into the attic. When the police arrived, Otto was crouched silently directly above their heads, listening to them investigate the crime. Even more bizarrely, after the murder, Otto moved with Dolly to her new home, where she once again forced him to live in the attic. He only came out after her brief arrest, when she begged Shapiro to deliver groceries to her secret lover. Otto was eventually convicted of manslaughter, but because the statute of limitations had already expired, he was allowed to walk free. Dolly also escaped justice because the jury was hopelessly deadlocked on her conspiracy charges. Otto disappeared into history, and Dolly lived out the rest of her life in Los Angeles, passing away in 1961, just 2 weeks after getting married yet again. Now, let us move to August 2nd, 1963, at a beautiful wilderness camping resort located on Deep Lake in the state of Washington. A family of 5, including 4-year-old Bobby Pankman, his 2 older brothers, and his parents, Edna and her husband, had just arrived for a fun-filled weekend in nature. The next morning, Edna decided she wanted to take her 3 boys on a hike. She had heard from some other campers that there was an old, overgrown logging road directly behind their campsite that led to a beautiful, secluded little waterfall. Edna got the boys ready, said goodbye to her husband, who decided to stay behind at the camp, and set off down the trail. As soon as they stepped onto the logging road, Edna noticed how wild and untouched it was. The grass was waist-high, the ground was covered in loose rocks, and there were fallen branches everywhere. It was completely obvious that no vehicle had been down this road in decades. They walked for a short distance until they reached a small turnoff that headed down toward the rushing water of the creek. Edna looked at the path and saw that it was incredibly rough and covered in thick, thorny brush. This presented a problem because 4-year-old Bobby was going through a stubborn phase where he absolutely refused to wear shoes. His feet were completely bare, and there was no way he could walk through those thorns without hurting himself. So Edna made a decision. She told Bobby to sit down right on the edge of the clear logging road, and she instructed her 6-year-old son, Jimmy, to sit right next to him to keep him company. She told them to wait there for just a few minutes while she and her oldest son, 10-year-old Bill, pushed through the brush to check out the water. Once they made sure it was safe, she would come back, pick Bobby up, and they would all look at the waterfall together. Bobby did not mind and sat down, while Jimmy was a bit disappointed but complied. Edna and Bill pushed through the thick brush and walked down to the water. The physical distance between the two groups was incredibly small, only about 10 feet. However, because the brush was so dense and tall, they could not see each other, but they were well within easy shouting distance. Jimmy, sitting on the road with his younger brother, quickly grew restless. He wanted to see the waterfall, and he did not want to sit still. After only about a minute, Jimmy made a decision that he would regret for the rest of his life. He stood up, left his 4-year-old barefoot brother sitting alone on the road, and ran through the brush to join his mother and older brother. As soon as Edna saw Jimmy emerge from the bushes, she was furious. She scolded him for leaving Bobby alone and immediately turned around to walk back to the road. The entire time Bobby was left completely alone was no more than 60 seconds. But when Edna, Bill, and Jimmy stepped back onto the logging road, Bobby was gone. Initially, Edna was not terrified. She figured Bobby had simply gotten bored, stood up, and crawled behind a nearby tree or went to hide in the tall grass to play a game. After all, they were in a completely isolated area. They had not heard any footsteps, no car engines, and no voices. It was completely silent. Edna began calling Bobby's name, expecting him to gigglingly pop out from behind a bush. But there was no answer. She and the boys began searching the immediate area, checking behind every tree and looking in the ditches, but there was absolutely no sign of the 4-year-old. Edna's annoyance quickly turned into absolute heart-stopping terror. She sent her older boys to look by the water while she ran up and down the road, screaming Bobby's name, but her voice only echoed back to her through the silent forest. Realizing she needed help, Edna gathered her boys and ran as fast as she could back to their campsite. She grabbed her husband, and they immediately contacted the local authorities. Within hours, a massive search and rescue operation was underway. The police questioned Edna and the boys extensively, asking if they had heard any strange noises, any breaking branches, or any voices during that 60-second window. But all of them swore they had heard absolutely nothing. It was as if Bobby had simply ceased to exist. The search continued for 3 days with no results. Finally, the search team brought in a highly trained bloodhound. They gave the dog one of Bobby's shoes to catch his scent, and the dog immediately keyed in. But instead of tracking toward the water or toward the campsite, the dog turned and began running up the logging road, deeper and deeper into the rugged, unexplored wilderness. The dog ran for nearly 2 miles, never losing the scent until it suddenly stopped at a fork in the road. The dog began sniffing frantically around a small, completely bare patch of dirt on the ground. The searchers carefully excavated the dirt, hoping to find a buried item or a footprint, but there was absolutely nothing there. They gave the dog the scent again, but the dog simply returned to the exact same bare patch of dirt and sat down. After 7 days of searching every square inch of the forest, the official search was called off. The lead investigator held a press conference and stated that they believed Bobby had been abducted. His logic was simple. Bobby was a barefoot 4-year-old who had vanished in under 60 seconds. He could not have walked far on his own without crying out in pain from the rocks and thorns, and his family would have heard him. But if it was an abduction, it meant that a kidnapper had to have been hiding in the thick brush, silently watching the family, waiting for the exact moment Jimmy left Bobby alone. And then, in a 60-second window, this person had to have snatched the child, muffled his screams, and carried him away into the deep forest without making a single sound or leaving a single footprint. It seemed highly unlikely. The police also investigated the possibility of a wild animal attack. They brought in bear hunting dogs and cougar experts, but they found absolutely no tracks, no fur, no blood, and no signs of a struggle. There were no drag marks on the ground, which would always be present if a predator had dragged a child away. At one point, out of sheer desperation, someone suggested that a massive golden eagle must have swooped down from the sky, grabbed Bobby by the shoulders, and carried him away silently. But that theory was quickly dismissed as highly improbable. To this day, the disappearance of Bobby Pankman remains one of the most chilling and inexplicable mysteries in the history of Washington State Deep, In the Sierra Nevada mountain range of California, there is a small, legendary hunting camp that has been used by a select group of men since the 1950s. The camp is located in an incredibly remote, high-altitude area, and its exact coordinates are kept a closely guarded secret. Even if you were given map coordinates, you would likely walk right past it because it consists of nothing more than a small dirt clearing, a fire pit, and a shelter built out of massive, heavy fallen logs. The fastest way to reach the camp is by an arduous 8-mile horseback ride through extremely rugged, unmarked terrain involving a steep 4,000-foot elevation gain. In early 1971, a young hunter named Ron Moorhead was invited to join the 3 founding members of the camp for a weekend of deer hunting. When Ron arrived, he felt like he had stepped into paradise. The camp was surrounded by massive, ancient white fir trees, a crystal-clear freshwater stream flowed nearby, and the deer population was incredibly abundant. The only real danger was the large population of black bears in the area. To protect themselves, the men had constructed a sturdy shelter out of heavy timber, complete with a solid wooden door that they could lock from the inside if a bear decided to wander into their camp. In late November of 1971, Ron and the other 3 hunters returned to the camp. After a successful day of hunting, they were standing around the roaring campfire, cooking dinner and sharing stories, when they suddenly heard a strange, low-grunting sound coming from the dark forest. Usually, when they heard a bear, they would simply pack up their food, walk inside their timber shelter, and wait for the animal to lose interest and leave. But as they stopped talking to listen, the sound suddenly transformed into something that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. It was a loud, booming, high-pitched whoop that sounded exactly like a giant ape. But before they could even process what they were hearing, a second, distinctly different voice responded with a similar whoop from a completely different part of the forest. There were at least 2 massive creatures in the darkness, and they were actively communicating with each other. Terrified, the 4 rugged hunters scrambled inside their timber shelter, slammed the heavy door shut, and barred it from the inside. As they huddled together in the darkness, they heard the heavy, thudding footsteps of the creatures approaching the camp. The footsteps stopped just outside the circle of firelight. Then, the creatures began to speak. But they were not making animal noises. They were communicating in a highly complex, rapid language that sounded incredibly human-like, yet completely alien. It was a series of guttural grunts, clicks, and high-pitched jabbers. The creatures walked around the perimeter of the shelter, their heavy steps shaking the ground. Ron and the men stood in the very center of the cabin, terrified that a massive hand would reach through the gaps in the logs and grab them. Finally, after several hours, the vocalizations faded away into the distance. The next morning, as soon as the sun came up, the men packed up their gear, mounted their horses, and rode out of the mountains as fast as they could. They were deeply shaken, but Ron became completely obsessed with finding out what had visited their camp. He convinced the other hunters to return with him a few weeks later, but this time, Ron brought a state-of-the-art reel-to-reel audio tape recorder. They set up the camp, made a large fire, and waited. Late that evening, they heard the heavy footsteps returning. The men retreated into the shelter, Ron turned on the recorder, and they captured some of the most famous and controversial audio recordings in paranormal history, now known as the Sierra Sounds. Years later, Ron sent the raw, unedited tapes to Dr. Lynn Curlin, a highly respected professor of electrical engineering at the University of Wyoming. Dr. Curlin and his team of audio experts analyzed the recordings using advanced frequency equipment. They concluded that the audio was completely authentic and had not been edited, speeded up, or doctored in any way. Furthermore, they determined that the physical vocal tract required to produce the deep, booming frequencies and the incredibly high pitches on the tape was far larger than that of any normal human being. Based on the acoustic data, the creature making the sounds would have to be between 7 feet 3 inches and 8 feet tall with a massive lung capacity. Professional cryptolinguist named Scott Nelson also studied the tapes and concluded that the sounds represented a complex, non-human language with distinct syntax and repeating linguistic patterns. To this day, despite numerous attempts by skeptics to prove the recordings were a hoax, the Sierra Sounds remain an unexplained piece of evidence suggesting that something massive, intelligent, and completely unknown is hiding in the deepest forests of the Sierra Nevada. Let us now travel to April 29, 2001, in the rugged wilderness of the Upper Buffalo Wilderness area in the state of Arkansas. 6-year-old Haley Zaga was on a weekend hiking trip with her grandparents. This particular area is a federally designated wilderness, which means no motorized vehicles or paved roads are allowed, making it incredibly isolated and pristine. The family had hiked up a steep trail to the top of a massive sandstone bluff that rose nearly 200 feet above the rushing waters of the Buffalo River below. After enjoying the breathtaking view, they turned around at about 11 in the morning to head back down the trail. About 30 minutes into their descent, Haley spotted a beautiful waterfall located just off the main path, cascading down a steep rocky cliff. Being an energetic 6-year-old, she desperately wanted to go look at it. But her grandparents looked at the terrain and realized that the only way to reach the waterfall was to climb down a steep, slippery cliffside using the roots of a tree. Fearing for her safety, they firmly told Haley that they could not go to the waterfall and needed to stick to the main trail. Haley was furious. She threw a massive tantrum, sat flat on the dirt path, and refused to move, telling her grandparents that they would have to carry her. Her grandparents decided to use a common parenting technique. They told her they were going to leave her behind and began walking slowly down the trail, fully expecting Haley to realize she was being left, stand up, and run to catch up with them. And indeed, after a moment, Haley did stand up and began walking behind them. The grandparents kept walking, but Haley was intentionally moving as slowly as possible to express her anger. The grandparents made sure to keep her in their sight, turning around every few yards to confirm she was there. They would walk, turn, and see her. Walk, turn, and see her. But then, they turned around one more time and the trail was completely empty. Haley had vanished. The grandparents immediately ran back up the trail, calling her name. They assumed she had stepped behind a large oak tree to play a trick on them, but as they searched the surrounding brush, there was no sign of her. The forest was completely silent. For the next hour and a half, they frantically ran up and down the steep trail, screaming her name until their throats were raw, but she was gone. Desperate, they ran down to the nearest ranger station to report her missing. What followed was the largest and most intensive search and rescue operation in the history of Arkansas. Hundreds of searchers, including 8 specialized K-9 teams, helicopters equipped with advanced thermal imaging cameras, and National Guard troops, flooded the wilderness. For 2 days, they searched the bluffs, the riverbanks, and the dense forest, but they found absolutely nothing. One dog team briefly tracked her scent to a nearby dirt road, but the trail went cold, leading investigators to fear she had been abducted by a passing motorist. But then, 51 hours into her disappearance, 2 volunteers who were searching a remote area nearly 2 miles away from where she was last seen spotted something near a small creek. They walked closer and saw a little girl sitting on a rock, calmly dangling her bare feet in the cool water. She looked up, waved, and when they asked her if she was Haley, she calmly said, yes. Aside from a few minor scratches and some mosquito bites, she was completely unharmed and in excellent spirits. After she was reunited with her hysterical family and given a clean bill of health at the hospital, investigators sat down with Haley to find out how she had survived. Haley explained that she had been walking behind her grandparents when she looked down at the ground for a second. When she looked back up, her grandparents were gone, and she was suddenly standing in front of a dense wall of trees with no sign of the trail. Instead of panicking, she simply began walking. When night fell, she climbed to the top of a high bluff and slept on the cold stone. The next morning, she walked down the other side of the bluff, found the river, and followed it until she found a small cave, where she slept for her second night. The investigators were stunned. The bluffs in that area are incredibly steep, and there is only one narrow, highly dangerous path that leads down to the river. It would be nearly impossible for a lost 6-year-old to navigate it in the dark without falling to her death. Furthermore, during her first night on the bluff, multiple helicopters with thermal imaging had flown directly over that exact spot and had seen absolutely nothing. When they asked Haley how she found her way down the dangerous cliffs, she said, "My friend Alicia showed me the way. She stood in front of me the whole time to make sure I did not fall." The investigators assumed Alicia was simply an imaginary friend that Haley's mind had created as a coping mechanism to handle the trauma of being lost. But when they asked her to describe Alicia, Haley gave a highly detailed description. She said Alicia was 4 years old, had long black hair, dark brown eyes, was a bit shorter than her, and loved to sing songs and tell jokes. Haley even began singing a specific song that she claimed Alicia had taught her. The story of Haley's survival and her mysterious friend Alicia was published in the local newspapers. Shortly after, several readers contacted the authorities with a chilling piece of information. 23 years earlier, in the exact same section of the Upper Buffalo Wilderness, a 4-year-old girl named Alana had gone missing on the bluffs and had tragically died from a fall. Alana had long black hair, dark brown eyes, and was 4 years old, matching Haley's description of Alicia perfectly. Years later, Haley posted a video on her personal YouTube channel reflecting on her experience. She stated that before her disappearance, she had never had an imaginary friend, and she never had one after. But to this day, she believes that the spirit of the little girl who died on those bluffs guided her safely through the dark forest and saved her life. On December 4th, 1961, a Portland, Oregon fire inspector named James McCormack Sr. decided to take his 16-year-old son, James Jr., on a weekend hunting trip. Both men were passionate outdoorsmen who spent almost all of their free time in nature, and they decided to head to Larch Mountain, located just 30 miles outside of the city. Despite its close proximity to Portland, Larch Mountain was known as one of the most rugged, densely forested, and unforgiving terrains in the Pacific Northwest. The weather forecast for that morning called for cold temperatures and a light dusting of snow, but nothing severe. Since they were only planning a quick day trip, they did not pack any heavy winter gear, tents, or sleeping bags. They simply had their warm hunting clothes, their rifles, and their trusted hunting dog. They parked their vehicle at the base of the mountain and began hiking up into the dense pine forest. But as the afternoon wore on, the weather suddenly took a drastic and unexpected turn. The temperature plummeted below freezing, and a massive blizzard swept over the mountain, dumping heavy, wet snow and freezing rain. Realizing that the conditions were becoming dangerous, James Sr. decided they should cut the trip short and head back to their car. But the snow was falling so fast and thick that it had completely covered their footprints and obscured the natural landmarks they were using to navigate. With no GPS and only a map and compass, they quickly realized they were hopelessly lost. As the sun began to set, the blizzard grew more violent. James Sr. knew that trying to hike in the pitch black during a winter storm was a death sentence, so he decided they had to survive the night in the woods. Because they had no shelter, James Sr. decided their best bet was to climb up into the thick branches of a massive pine tree. This would keep them off the freezing ground, protect them from predators, and the heavy pine needles would provide some cover from the falling snow. They spent a miserable, freezing, completely sleepless night huddled in the tree, holding on to each other and their shivering dog. When the sun finally rose the next morning, they climbed down from the tree, stiff and freezing, but determined to find their way home. They began walking in the direction they believed led back to the road. But after several hours of hiking through waist-deep snow, they had still not found any signs of civilization. James Sr. stopped to check his map, trying to figure out where they were. Suddenly, his son, James Jr., who was a remarkably tough and stoic kid, looked at his father and said, "Dad, I feel completely delirious. I cannot think straight and I can barely stand up. I need to sit down." James Sr. was deeply alarmed. His son was showing the classic early signs of severe hypothermia. They had plenty of water and food, and they were wearing warm clothes, but the extreme cold and the freezing rain from the night before had taken a severe physical toll. Within minutes, James Jr.'s condition deteriorated rapidly. He began speaking in incoherent gibberish and completely lost the ability to stand. James Sr. knew that if they stayed there, his son would die. Being a physically fit firefighter, James Sr. picked his teenage son up, hoisted him over his shoulders in a fireman's carry, and began marching through the deep snow for 3 agonizing hours. James Sr. carried his son through the blizzard, his muscles burning and his lungs gasping for air. But as the sun began to set for a second time, he reached his physical limit. He collapsed into the snow next to a large tree, completely exhausted and defeated. He realized they were going to have to spend another freezing night in the wild, and he did not know if his son would survive it. As they lay there shivering, both James Sr. and his son suddenly saw a pair of incredibly bright white lights appear in the dark forest, about 100 feet directly in front of them. The lights looked exactly like the headlights of a car parked on a road. James Sr. felt a massive surge of hope. He thought they had somehow stumbled near a road and a rescue vehicle was sitting right there. He looked at his son and said, "Stay right here with the dog. I am going to run over and get their attention." James Sr. stood up and began running through the deep snow toward the bright lights, waving his arms and screaming for help. But as he ran, the lights did not stay still. They began to slowly move backward, deeper into the thick forest away from him. James Sr. kept running, pushing through the heavy branches, but the lights kept moving farther and farther away until they suddenly vanished completely into the darkness. James Sr. stopped, gasping for breath, and looked around. He realized there was no road, no tire tracks, and no vehicle. He was standing in the middle of a dense, untouched forest. Feeling a sudden, terrifying sense of dread, James Sr. turned around and ran back to the tree where he had left his son. But when he arrived, only their hunting dog was sitting there. James Jr. was gone. James Sr. was completely frantic. His son had been completely unable to stand or walk just minutes before, yet he had somehow stood up and vanished into the dark forest. James Sr. looked at the ground and, thanks to the dim light reflecting off the snow, he spotted a fresh set of footprints leading away from the tree. He grabbed his son's discarded backpack, called for the dog, and began following the tracks, screaming his son's name. But the blizzard was still dumping heavy snow, and within 30 minutes, the tracks were completely filled in and invisible. James Sr. was left alone in the dark, screaming for his son. He ran blindly through the night, driven by pure survival instinct, until the next morning, when he miraculously stumbled out of the forest and onto the porch of a remote mountain lodge, 6 miles away from where they had parked their car. The lodge staff immediately called the police, and a massive rescue effort was launched. Over 200 off-duty Portland firefighters rushed to Larch Mountain to find the fire inspector's son. James Sr., despite suffering from severe exhaustion and frostbite, refused medical attention and insisted on leading the search party back into the forest. A few hours into the search, they found James Jr.'s glasses case, followed by his heavy winter boots and his socks lying in the snow. Later that afternoon, they discovered his frozen body lying at the bottom of a steep cliff about 1,000 feet away. The medical examiner confirmed that he had not died from the fall, But from hypothermia and exposure, the discovery of the discarded boots and socks is a well-known phenomenon in forensic science, known as paradoxical undressing, which occurs in the final stages of severe hypothermia when the brain's temperature regulation fails, making the victim feel as though they are burning hot, prompting them to strip off their clothes before succumbing to the cold. But to this day, James Sr. has never been able to explain what those mysterious lights were in the forest, and why they appeared right before his son stood up and walked to his death. Let us now move to August 10, 2018 at the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport in Washington State. A 29-year-old ground service agent named Richard Russell, known to his friends and family by his nickname Bebo, arrived for his regular evening shift. Bebo was born in Key West, Florida, but had moved to Wasilla, Alaska when he was 7 years old. He was a beloved, highly athletic kid who competed in football and track in high school. After graduating, he moved to Oregon, where he met his wife, Hannah. Together, they ran a successful bakery for 3 years before deciding to move to Seattle to be closer to Hannah's family. To make ends meet, Bebo took a job as a ramper for Horizon Air at SeaTac Airport. His job consisted of loading and unloading heavy luggage from passenger aircraft, a physically demanding and low-paying job that Bebo found incredibly monotonous. But Bebo's job had one major perk: free airfare. He and Hannah used this benefit to travel all over the world, and Bebo frequently flew back to Alaska to visit his family. After 4 years of hard work, Bebo was promoted to a 2-person tow team which was responsible for moving giant passenger airplanes around the tarmac between flights. This job required him to go into the cockpits of these aircraft, turn on their basic electrical systems, and assist the tow driver. Bebo became completely fascinated by the complex array of switches, dials, and controls in the cockpits. Whenever he had the chance, he would ask commercial pilots detailed questions about what the various controls did, claiming he was just curious. On one occasion, a pilot caught Bebo flipping switches he was not authorized to touch and reported him, but he only received a mild warning. To everyone who knew him, Bebo was a kind, gentle, and incredibly funny man who loved to read and had dreams of one day becoming a military officer. No one had any idea that he was secretly struggling with his mental health. On that warm August evening, a commercial twin-engine turboprop passenger airplane, a Bombardier Q400 owned by Horizon Air, landed at SeaTac and was parked at a remote cargo bay. At exactly 7:15 p.m., Bebo walked over to the empty aircraft, climbed inside, and shut the door behind him. He sat in the captain's seat and began flipping switches, following the complex startup sequence he had memorized. Within minutes, the plane's massive propellers began to spin. Bebo hopped out, connected a tow vehicle, used it to push the plane backward out of the hangar, unhooked the tow vehicle, and climbed back into the cockpit. He began taxiing the giant passenger plane toward the active runway. Air traffic control immediately noticed the unauthorized movement of the aircraft and began frantically radioing the cockpit, demanding that the pilot stop immediately. But Bebo did not respond. He lined the massive plane up on the runway, pushed the throttles all the way forward, and took off into the Seattle sky. Bebo had absolutely no formal flight training. He had never flown a real airplane in his life. Yet, for the next hour, Bebo flew the giant passenger plane over the city of Seattle, performing mind-boggling aerial stunts. He did a full barrel roll just feet above the water of Puget Sound, went into steep vertical climbs, and performed massive loops that put extreme G-forces on the aircraft. Military F-15 fighter jets were scrambled to escort the plane, and thousands of terrified onlookers on the ground filmed the buzz sight on their cell phones, posting the videos to social media in real time. But the most incredible part of the entire event was the radio conversation between Bebo and a highly professional air traffic controller named Bill, who spent the next hour calmly trying to convince Bebo to land the plane safely. Bebo's voice was remarkably calm, relaxed, and cheerful, as if he were just playing a video game. He cracked jokes with the controller, talked about how beautiful the Olympic mountains looked from the sky, and expressed concern about how much fuel he was burning. But at one point, Bebo's tone turned incredibly sad and reflective. He apologized to the controller and said, "I got a lot of people who care about me, and it is going to disappoint them to hear that I did this. I would like to apologize to each and every one of them. I am just a broken guy. Got a few screws loose, I guess. Never really knew it until now." At 8:45 p.m., after performing one final spectacular barrel roll over the water, Bebo told the controller he was going to nose the plane down and call it a night. 1 minute later, the plane crashed into a heavily forested, remote section of Ketron Island in Puget Sound. Bebo was killed instantly, and he was the sole casualty of the crash. The internet quickly dubbed him the Sky King, fascinated by how a completely untrained baggage handler could successfully steal, fly, and perform advanced aerobatics in a complex commercial aircraft. It remains one of the most daring, tragic, and mysterious incidents in aviation history. In early July of 1953, Mr. and Mrs. Huggin, along with their 3 young daughters, packed up their car and left their home in Winnipeg, Canada for a 6-week summer vacation. They were headed to Wade, Ontario, a deeply remote, heavily forested, and swampy area in northern Canada, where the girls' grandparents owned a secluded summer cabin near Fox Lake. The family arrived late on the evening of July 4th, so they immediately went to bed. The next morning, the weather was beautiful, and the adults decided they wanted to take the girls down to Fox Lake for a day of swimming and picnicking. While the adults were inside the cabin gathering blankets, food, and towels, the three young girls went outside to play in the yard. Because the cabin was completely isolated with no neighbors for miles, the parents were not worried about their safety. The two older girls were playing in the front yard, while 5-year-old Geraldine decided to play on the side of the cabin out of sight of her sisters. The parents periodically poked their heads out the window to check on them, and they confirmed that Geraldine was happily playing in the dirt on the side of the house. At exactly 10 a.m., the parents finished packing the car and went outside to gather the children. They walked to the front yard, picked up the two older girls, and then walked to the side of the cabin to get Geraldine. But she was gone. Initially, they thought she had run inside the house, but a quick search of the cabin came up empty. They walked around the yard, calling her name. In the silent, remote forest, their voices carried for miles, and they expected Geraldine to hear them and walk back. But there was only silence. Within 10 minutes of being left alone, the 5-year-old had completely vanished. The panicked family called the police, who arrived and realized that searching the dense, swampy Canadian bush was going to be incredibly difficult. They brought in professional native Canadian trackers who knew the local terrain, and they requested assistance from the Canadian Army. But just as the search began, the skies opened up and a massive rainstorm swept over the area, completely washing away any physical footprints or scent trails. The search continued for 3 days. Geraldine's heartbroken father told the searchers that his daughter was terrified of the dark, and that once the sun set, she would likely sit down and cry rather than continue walking, meaning she had to be close. On the third evening, searchers found a set of tiny footprints pressed into the wet moss on top of a high cliff overlooking Fox Lake. The prints showed that she had walked to the edge, looked at the water, and then turned around and walked back down into a dense, mosquito-infested swamp. The search effort was immediately shifted to the swamp. On the 7th day of the search, trackers discovered a second set of footprints in the wet mud of the swamp. But these prints were massive. They were far larger than any human foot, and they did not match any known local animal like a bear or a moose. It looked as though something massive had been walking through the swamp right around the time Geraldine went missing. 2 days later, trackers searching near the eastern shore of another body of water called Long Lake, located 2.5 miles away, found a small piece of Geraldine's plaid shirt snagged on a thorn bush. Within 24 hours, they discovered her remains in a small meadow nearby. The scene was deeply disturbing. Geraldine's body had been heavily scavenged by wild animals, but strangely, her clothing was completely intact and showed no signs of being torn or covered in blood. This indicated that she had not been killed by a predator like a wolf or a bear, as their claws and teeth would have shredded her clothes. Instead, it appeared she had died first, and animals had scavenged her body afterward. But when investigators followed a strange drag mark from her body back into the meadow, they found a large patch of grass that had been completely matted down, as if a massive, heavy creature had been lying there, watching her. The official cause of death was listed as exposure, but the mystery of what massive creature left those giant tracks and lay in the grass near her body has never been solved. In September of 2012, a 53-year-old woman named Linda Arteaga decided to travel to St. Joe, Arkansas, to visit her brother, Eddie Huff. St. Joe is an incredibly rural, mountainous town located right on the border of the Buffalo River National Park, a vast wilderness area filled with dense forests, steep cliffs, and hidden caves. On Saturday, September 22nd, Linda and Eddie decided to go for a casual walk in the park. Eddie had heard from a local friend about a secret, highly abundant fishing hole located deep in the woods, and he wanted to find it. To find the spot, they decided to step off the marked hiking trail and push deeper into the dense trees. Very quickly, they realized they had lost their bearings. Since it was still early afternoon, they were not worried and figured they would eventually hit a road. But as the sun began to set, they were still completely lost. They spent the night huddled together on the cold forest floor. The next day, Sunday, they spent the entire day walking in circles, screaming for help, but the forest was completely empty. By Monday morning, something strange happened. Eddie somehow managed to stumble out of the forest, walk to his car, and drive back to his house. When he walked through the door, his family was shocked. They had been looking for them for 2 days. They asked him, "Eddie, where have you been? And where is Linda?" Eddie looked at them, completely dazed, and calmly said, "Everything is fine. I dropped Linda off at a relative's house," but when the family called the relative, they confirmed that they had not seen Linda or Eddie in weeks. When they asked Eddie where Linda really was, his eyes went blank, and he said, "I have absolutely no idea." Realizing Eddie was suffering from extreme mental confusion, the family called the police, and a massive search was launched for Linda on Thursday, 5 days after she went missing. Searchers riding ATVs through an incredibly thick, remote section of the forest found Linda lying in the brush. She was alive, but like her brother, she was highly confused and did not know where she was. She was rushed to the hospital where she gradually began to regain her memory. The story she told the police was terrifying. She said that on Monday morning, she woke up and felt a sudden, uncontrollable urge to run into the forest to get help because she believed her brother was dying. As she was running through the trees screaming for help, she suddenly saw a group of hikers standing in a small clearing off in the distance. She felt a massive surge of relief and began waving her arms and running toward them. But as she got closer, she noticed that the people were not moving or waving back. They were simply standing completely still, staring at her with blank expressions. When she got about 100 yards away, the entire group suddenly ducked behind the thick trunks of the trees as if they were trying to hide from her. Linda stopped, feeling incredibly uneasy. She slowly walked closer, and when she was about 50 yards away, the people poked their heads out from behind the trees, stared at her, and then pulled back. Terrified by their bizarre behavior, Linda began slowly backing away. The group then stepped out from behind the trees and continued to silently watch her. Linda turned and ran as fast as she could. That night, she lay on the ground in the pitch-black forest, completely alone. She said that all night long she could hear the heavy footsteps of multiple people slowly walking in a circle around her, just out of sight. On her final morning in the forest, she woke up as the sun was starting to rise. She sat up and felt an overwhelming sensation that she was being watched. She slowly turned her head to the right, and standing next to a tree just 20 yards away was a tall, pitch-black, featureless shadow figure staring directly at her. She looked to her left, and there was another one. She looked behind her, and she was completely surrounded by dozens of these silent, dark shadow figures standing behind the trees. As soon as they realized she could see them, they all turned and ran into the forest in different directions. While some skeptics believe that Linda and Eddie must have ingested toxic, hallucinogenic berries in the forest that caused their shared delirium, others believe they encountered something truly anomalous hiding in the deep woods of Arkansas. Finally, let us travel to May of 1950 on the snow-covered slopes of Mount St. Helens in Washington state. A 32-year-old experienced mountaineer and ski patrolman named Jim Carter was part of a 20-person climbing expedition. Jim was an incredibly skilled, technical skier who spent his entire life on the mountains. The group had hiked high up above the tree line on Mount St. Helens, and their plan was to put on their skis and make a thrilling run down the pristine, untouched snow of the mountain. As they were preparing their gear, Jim looked at the group and said, "Hey, I'm going to ski down a little bit ahead of you guys. I want to set up my camera on its tripod so I can get a great action photo of you all as you ski past me." The group agreed, and Jim took off. He skied down a short distance and made a left turn into a flatter, safer area known as Dog's Head, which was the perfect spot to set up a camera. As soon as he made the turn, he went out of sight of the main group. The group took a little extra time to get ready, wanting to make sure they all went down together. Finally, they took off, banking hard around the corner of Dog's Head, ready to smile for Jim's camera, but when they reached the area, Jim was not there. His camera and tripod were nowhere to be seen. They assumed he had gotten tired of waiting for them and had simply skied all the way to the bottom of the mountain. So, they skied down to the base camp. But when they arrived, there was no sign of Jim. Fearing he had suffered a fall, they immediately contacted the mountain rescue team. The searchers hiked up to Dog's Head and began looking for clues. The only thing they found was a discarded, empty film box buried in the snow. But next to the box, they found Jim's distinct ski tracks. Instead of heading down the safe southern route of the mountain, Jim's tracks showed that he had turned sharply to the east and begun skiing directly toward a highly dangerous vertical gorge known as Ape Canyon. As the searchers followed the tracks, they were completely horrified. Jim was not skiing in a normal, controlled manner. His tracks showed that he was skiing in a completely straight, vertical line down the steepest, most dangerous slopes of the mountain, making no turns to slow himself down. Even more incredibly, the tracks showed that he had leaped over massive, deadly ice crevasses at full speed, jumps that even the most daring professional skiers would never attempt unless they had a death wish. He was skiing at a terrifying breakneck speed. The tracks led directly to the sheer vertical edge of Ape Canyon and simply went off the cliff. The head of the mountain rescue team looked at the tracks and told the media that a skier of Jim's caliber would only ski like that if he was running for his life from a terrifying pursuer. For 10 days, 75 searchers combed the incredibly dangerous depths of Ape Canyon, but they found absolutely no sign of Jim, his skis, or his camera. Strangely, during the search, every single volunteer reported feeling an intense hostile sensation that they were being watched from the cliffs above. The feeling was so intense that many of them refused to search unless they were paired with an armed guard. Jim Carter was never found, and his disappearance remains one of the most terrifying mysteries of Mount St. Helens. Now, let us travel to France in 1974, where a brilliant young man named Jean-Claude Roman enrolled in medical school in the city of Lyon. Jean-Claude was a model student, highly respected by his peers and professors for his incredible intellect and calm demeanor. In 1980, he married his beautiful girlfriend, and they settled into a gorgeous home on the French-Swiss border. A few years later, they had two wonderful children, a boy and a girl. In 1983, Jean-Claude proudly announced to his family that he had officially graduated from medical school and had landed a highly prestigious, lucrative job as a research cardiologist at the World Health Organization headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. His research focused on finding revolutionary new treatments for heart disease. His wife was incredibly proud of him, telling all of their friends that her husband was a brilliant scientist who worked tirelessly in his high-tech lab to save lives. For nearly 20 years, Jean-Claude lived a life of absolute luxury. He drove a beautiful luxury car, wore expensive suits, and sent his children to the most prestigious private schools. His friends and family admired him as the ultimate success story. But on the morning of Monday, January 11th, 1993, Jean-Claude's best friend of 20 years, a fellow doctor named Luc, received a frantic phone call. There had been a horrific fire at Jean-Claude's home. Luc rushed to the scene and watched in horror as firefighters pulled the charred bodies of Jean-Claude's wife and two children from the burning ruins. Jean-Claude was the only survivor, but he had inhaled massive amounts of smoke and had slipped into a deep coma. Later that afternoon, Luc went to the hospital to visit his friend. He was shocked to find two armed police officers standing guard outside Jean-Claude's room. Refusing to let anyone inside, the officers pulled Luc into a private room and asked him to sit down. They told him that they had investigated the fire and had made some highly disturbing discoveries. The fire was not an accident, it had been intentionally set. But that was nothing compared to the next piece of information. They looked at Luc and said, Jean-Claude Roman is not a doctor. He has never been a doctor, and he has never worked for the World Health Organization. Luc was completely speechless. It turned out that back in 1974, during his first year of medical school, Jean-Claude had panicked and failed to show up for his final exam. Under the school's rules, he was allowed to retake the first year. Jean-Claude retook the first year of medical school for 12 consecutive years, never advancing, while telling his family that he was progressing normally. When he claimed to have gotten the job at the World Health Organization, his daily routine became a mind-boggling lie. Every single morning, Jean-Claude would say goodbye to his wife, get into his car, and drive across the Swiss border. He would park his car in the public parking lot of the WHO headquarters, walk into the public lobby, and spend the entire day reading free medical pamphlets, writing fake research papers, and visiting the gift shop. When he grew bored of the lobby, he would simply park his car on remote mountain roads and sleep, or read books for hours before driving home at his regular time. When he had to go on international medical conferences, he would drive to a cheap local motel, stay inside the room for a week, and return home with souvenirs and fake stories of his travels. To fund his incredibly expensive lifestyle, Jean-Claude had devised a highly complex financial scam. Because he was a respected UN doctor, he convinced his parents, his uncle, and his close friends to give him their entire life savings so that he could invest them in a secret, highly lucrative Swiss bank account that was only available to UN employees. He simply took their money and used it to pay his mortgage, buy luxury goods, and pay his children's tuition. But by late 1992, the money had run out and his relatives began asking for their funds. One of his friends became suspicious and checked the official staff directory of the World Health Organization, only to find that Jean-Claude's name was completely missing. Realizing that his massive 20-year lie was about to be exposed, Jean-Claude decided to take horrific action. On the night of January 9th, 1993, Jean-Claude walked into his bedroom and beat his wife to death with a rolling pin. The next morning, he made breakfast for his children, watched cartoons with them, and then shot them both in the back of the head. He then got into his car, drove to his parents' house, shot them both to death along with their dog, and then drove back to his home. He took a handful of expired sleeping pills, lit the house on fire, and lay down on the floor, expecting to die, but the fire department arrived sooner than he expected and saved his life. Jean-Claude was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The story remains one of the most chilling examples of how far a man will go to protect a lie. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.